Good morning. My name is Len Losik. I'm President and Chief Technical Officer of a company called Failure Analysis, located in Santa Cruz, California. And I want to discuss with you the results of my research that I did for the Canadian Space Agency. The technology that my company works in is called Prognostics Health Management, or PHM. And for the first time, it allows behavior to be predicted with certainty rather than in probabilities. And we license the technology as well as provide engineering services. And as an expert in the field of predicting equipment failures, the Canadian Space Agency asked me if I would check the feasibility of using our technology to be able to predict which astronauts would become mentally ill on a deep space mission that would last anywhere between 2 and 3 years while they were in training, so that they so that they would not be used. And so the title of my presentation today is How Space Medicine Research we did for the Canadian Space Agency explains the cause of such serious diseases as autism, cancer, mental illness, arthritis, and autoimmune and immune system diseases. And for a few of those, it actually provides a recovery. And when I talk about autism, arthritis, and diabetes, I'm also referring to childhood, primarily childhood autism, arthritis, and diabetes. And so the topics that I want to cover today, hopefully I'll get through, will be how we discovered the cause of childhood autism, diabetes, and arthritis, and then the immune system diseases from space technology that I will keep referring to as PHM. And also I used in my research the results from AIDS research that was done over the past several years as a result of the epidemic of AIDS in foreign countries, particularly Africa as well as South America, and also the results from cancer research. And so under the cause of childhood diseases, I'll be covering autism, arthritis, diabetes, cancer, which is most common, I think, is leukemia, and also mental illness. And I'll be discussing the cause of the normal aging process, the latest theory that we think causes just normal aging of the human body, as well as premature aging. And I'm interested in the premature aging aspect because the technology that we work in and license finds premature aging in either hardware or software systems, rockets and satellites, any kind of vehicles, if it's included in the design. And so we applied the technology to disease and found that we could indeed find the precursors to diseases as well as identify premature aging. And also I want to discuss the possibility of prevention and recovery for a few of these diseases, really all of them pretty much with the exception of autism and diabetes. And so I hope also to include the response that that NASA did in response to our research results that we did for the Canadian Space Agency. We published them to NASA headquarters, and they took some serious immediate actions. I was a long-term member of NASA's Future in Space Operations colloquium for several years, and during that time I was pushing the group to go towards providing artificial gravity on spacecraft for interplanetary space missions. And currently, or at that time, NASA was not interested in doing that because the cost and complexity of a space station that would provide artificial gravity through centrifugal force was far more complex and expensive than they'd ever conceived, even though as early as back in the 1950s, academia realized that artificial gravity would be necessary for people to travel to other planets. And that's because of the duration of the trip to other planets. For instance, the latest planet NASA was talking about going to was Mars. And they were talking about anywhere between a 9-month and a year period for the astronauts to get to Mars without any gravity whatsoever. And the manned program side of NASA believed that that was not feasible, that the human body could not function for 9 months under zero gravity, arrive at Mars, land, and then be able to put together the structures that were necessary under Mars gravity, which is roughly 1/3 that of the Earth. So you've got human bodies that are for 9 months to a year used to zero gravity, and then on Mars they were to live there for a year under 1/3 gravity, and then be launched back into space under zero gravity and back to Earth for another 9 months. And the manned space program side of NASA believe that we are just not physically capable of doing that. And so that's why I argued and spoke about providing artificial gravity for deep space missions to the unmanned space program side of NASA, which, by the way, is much larger than the manned program side. And the majority of the people that run NASA headquarters, as well as the different science centers, the majority of the management are people from the unmanned space program side of NASA, and so don't understand the complexity or the need for artificial gravity on deep space missions. And so during my discussion, I hope to be explaining a lot about the PHM technology, because it does allow us to predict certain events with certainty. And that's new. Normally things are predicted with, in a probabilistic way, with what's the probabilities of something occurring. And the new technology allows us to predict certain events with certainty. And I'll be discussing which industries that I have worked in and that this technology is being used in by other people. And so I'll explain why PHM is able to identify premature aging that causes both equipment failures and also for people to die prematurely. And then how PHM, which I apply it in several industries, but it was developed by me in the space industry on the Global Positioning Air Force's GPS program, Global Positioning System. I was the Boeing GPS space and ground segment manager for many years, and I was solely responsible I was on contract to the Air Force to provide whatever was necessary in order to get the GPS program funded by the Department of Defense. So I was responsible for the GPS spacecraft design and manufacturing, the test, the launch, and the on-orbit performance during its test and evaluation period about 30 years ago. And because of the extremely high performance of the spacecraft on orbit that was due specifically to using PHM technology on the data coming from the satellites, the GPS program was funded by the DoD. I'll also discuss how for certain diseases the possibility of recovery exists, and that's particularly in cancer, mental illness, in autoimmune and immune system diseases, and not only how to recover, but also how to prevent from getting them in the first place. And if you do acquire one of these diseases and you get on medication, what is it that you can do to prevent yourself from a return of these diseases as well? And the understanding, the explanations that I'm going to give today will hopefully help you understand how each of us can stop getting these serious diseases, both by infants as a fetus, as well as children and adults. And so as a result, we've been working with communicating with the pharmaceutical industries to look at our information and work in the directions that we're proposing which is beyond where they're at right now. The current state of the art for the medical industry is looking at using the natural benefits of our own immune system to combat serious diseases. And my explanation, my presentation today will show what is the next level that the pharmaceutical company needs to go to, which is not the immune system, which is the fight or flight response, and then develop drugs to suppress the fight or flight response. In my presentation, I will be explaining how it is our own fight or flight response that is responsible for causing all of these diseases that I've just mentioned, all the way from childhood diseases of autism, arthritis, and diabetes, to mental illness and cancer. And in my presentation, I will show the research done by the AIDS community and the cancer research that agrees with our research, and it confirms our results. And so as a result of the work that I did for the Canadian Space Agency, I published a great deal of material to both the Canadian Space Agency as well as NASA, and they're available online under my name and mental illness. If you just Google mental illness with my name, Len Losik, my papers will come up in regards. I took that paper and then expanded it to a book. And while we were doing the research for mental illness for the Canadian Space Agency, I was ordered not to include in our published work any mention of the serious illnesses of bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, that the astronauts were acquiring serious mental and emotional illnesses, because if Congress was to find out that NASA was harming astronauts in this way, it was likely that they would get their budget cut. And so the Canadian Space Agency did not want to offend NASA and put their budget at risk based on the results of our research. And so my material was edited by the personnel at the Canadian Space Agency to only discuss, I think, depression and anxiety. And so that was what motivated me to publish the full results of my research on my own, outside of either the Canadian Space Agency, but I did publish it all to NASA, and I will be discussing what NASA's response was to our results. And so from there, I published a book called Curing Mental Illness, which identifies for the first time the cause of mental illness that we had to develop in order to be able to predict which astronauts were going to acquire mental illness, as well as in the event that a person does get mental illness out in deep space, how do you treat a person who gets mental illness who's millions of miles away from you? And so I also was able to provide a suggested recovery process for people that get mental illness, not just in space, but also in everyday life. In my published work for mental illness that I did, I briefly mentioned the fact that the result of our research was applicable to almost every known disease of man, that the fight or flight response was responsible for almost every disease known to man, with the exception of genetic-based diseases. And so that included cancer, diabetes, autism, and arthritis, which are all the immune and autoimmune system diseases, because these are all diseases that are caused or have to do with our immune system. And so although researchers are looking at the immune system and trying to control it and use its natural disease-fighting abilities to treat people now with cancer, what we say is, well, what controls the immune system? The immune system does not operate by itself. It is controlled by the fight or flight response. And each time that the fight or flight response is activated, And that's simply, when a threat appears in front of you, if we were still an agricultural-based community and we were out in the fields, and a bear was to approach us, our fight or flight response would kick in, and it would immediately cause us to run away and be able to run away very quickly and maybe climb a tree very quickly to be able to get away from the bear. That same response, which is meant to protect us in the event that danger, immediate danger exists, when that system, the fight or flight response, is activated too often, too frequently, or is not deactivated, is the reason that we get diseases such as cancer and arthritis and any of the autoimmune or immune system diseases. The autoimmune system diseases is caused by the fight or flight response kicking the immune system into overdrive, and then the immune system diseases are caused when the fight or flight response causes the immune system to be suppressed and not function like it's supposed to and do as good a job. And so one of the things I can't tell you, my research did not find, was how the fight or flight response decides to kick the immune system into overdrive, causing an autoimmune system disease, or suppress it, causing an immune system disease. And so that's something that's left unanswered. I will not be able to answer that. Only that the fight or flight response is the cause of these terrible diseases. The same physiological behavior that I'll be discussing with mental illness, that causes mental illness and causes cancer, the same physiological behavior that occurs in our body to cause either mental illness or cancer is exactly the same response that occurs in the fetus in a mother's womb to cause an infant to have autism. Autism is the result of the chemistry in the brain having been altered by the fight or flight response while the fetus is in the womb. That is exactly the same reason that causes mental illness in either children or adults, that their fight or flight response as a way of causing the people to become safe, take them out of whatever environment that they're in, taking them off their feet, getting them into a hospital. That same physiological behavior causes the chemicals in the brain to be altered just slightly enough so that they acquire a mental illness. Well, if that same behavior occurs to a fetus while it's in the womb, if it changes the chemistry in the brain just slightly while the brain is being developed, the neural paths in the brain will not form normally, and at birth the child will have autism, or slightly thereafter birth, several weeks or several months, the autistic symptoms can appear, and those would have been caused from the fetus fight or flight response deciding that its surrounding was too dangerous for it, and triggered the chemical change in the fetus's brain to give it mental illness while it was still a fetus. And so under those circumstances, the brain cannot develop properly. It's pretty darn close to normal. It gets developed pretty darn close. But the wiring, the actual electrical wiring that provides information transmittal within the brain itself that creates our reality, is just a little bit different than normal and causes, permanent brain damage we call autism. Just as in adults, that same physiological change that occurs in the chemistry of the brain causes the serious mental illnesses of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And fortunately, we have many, many drugs that are available to treat the symptoms of bipolar and schizophrenia, but we don't have any drugs that can correct if autism was to occur, when autism occurs. And so I wrote the book for people that want to have information about what the cause is of autism, as well as childhood diabetes and arthritis. The same physiological behavior of the body while the fetus is in the mother's womb is also responsible for causing childhood diabetes as well as childhood arthritis. And those 3 books are a result of the technology that I developed in order to get the GPS program funded by the Department of Defense. And that story I published in this book titled How GPS Won Funding by the Department of Defense. And that, again, that was done by myself, managing a series of teams of engineers up and down California, as well as Arizona. And so the story of how GPS was funded is in that. And that's an interesting story because although it was an Air Force program, the Air Force was also supporting the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, satellite, low altitude spy satellite program that was used to monitor the Soviet Union and their military activities. And the known size of the GPS program at the time, 30 years ago, there were Air Force officers that knew that if GPS was to get funded and became a real program, it would or could end up taking over all of the resources, the space resources, space assets used to support the CIA and our low altitude spy satellite program. And so within the Air Force, a group of officers decided that they were going to do whatever that they could to ensure that the GPS program was never funded. And so that story that occurred is in my book. And I was the person whom had to battle those Air Force officers and figure out alternative ways of doing what was necessary in order to get the GPS satellites to perform at their highest level so that the Department of Defense would fund it. At the time, there was already 2 existing low-altitude satellite, navigation satellite programs in existence, both supporting the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine fleet. And so GPS was not only battling internally for its existence, its performance had to be so good that it justified creating a 3rd satellite-based navigation system, defeating the 2 existing, well-funded, it had been in use for many years by the Navy. And that was what I was able to do by using PHM technology. These are 3 images of 3 different magazines that I've published articles in related to both PHM technology as well as my experience in working on a space program for NASA and for the military and for commercial or private space. And generally speaking, people think what's the difference between NASA, working for the military, and working for commercial space. Space is space, and it's not true. Each of those subgroups within the space industry have their own unique interests and requirements, and they are completely different. And the military's role is to defend the United States, and so they use the space assets, and they take their space assets extremely seriously, and their missions very seriously. And they ensure that whatever is needed to make their space program a success, that it happens. In the case of NASA, NASA follows the President of the United States. The head administrator of NASA just simply does whatever the President tells him to do with regards to space. And currently NASA is funded about an $18 billion level a year. And so NASA struggles with resources and with funding. It has a large number of science centers. I believe there's 6 or 7 science centers, which all of its overhead costs are all come out of that $18 billion, including the headquarters, including all of the unmanned satellites, unmanned space program, And it used to include the manned space probe. Oh, I'm sorry, it does again. Where NASA's building a new rocket to be able to launch astronauts up to the space station, and possibly could be modified to go to the moon or to other planets. So NASA's back into the manned space program after the space shuttle was defunded by Congress and turned off after NASA killed 7 astronauts in 2003 in the Columbia disaster. And so the requirements for NASA, NASA space, are different because they're pretty much a nice-to-have program, meaning that they're not essential to the safety of the United States, to the defense. The science data is nice to have for the scientists to work with. The manned space program, is a nice thing that the United States has with exploring outer space. We've got a gigantic manned International Space Station, 250 miles up in space, that we send astronauts to, as well as other countries. And we continue to talk about building other satellite way stations, going back to the moon, going on to Mars. But all of that really isn't essential to the United States defense like the military programs are. And so NASA struggles with arguing for more money and more money for programs who start out underfunded and then have to be have funding added later on. And so they're hauled in front of a Congress and ridiculed and harassed on a regular basis because of the different events that occur on different space programs that NASA funds on a regular basis. And I've worked on those NASA satellite programs, the International Space Program, International Space Station program, as well as the original Space Station Freedom design. I was a consultant also on the Space Hubble telescope, as well as the spacecraft manager for their geostationary weather satellite called GOES. Was responsible for the design and test of 10 of those years ago, and found the difference between working with NASA as a space, as an organization that works in space, and was able to compare it to my work I did with a military space program under GPS, as well as a couple of rockets for the military. And then I also worked simultaneously with the commercial space industry and saw how commercial space does things versus US government and the US military. And so I'm hopefully going to be able to relay some of that insight in my presentation as well. And the articles that I wrote pertain to all of those areas, commercial space, military space programs, and the commercial space programs, and were published in these 3 magazines. Space News, that's one of our primary industry newspaper magazines. And then SAT Magazine and MilSat Magazine are both online magazines that are available for free. And they would like you to take a subscription for free, and they'll send it to you in email, and you can read it for free. Okay, so who am I and who is Failure Analysis? As I mentioned, we're a technology licensing company and engineering services. And we provide engineering services to design and redesign any kind of hardware or software systems that would like to improve the reliability of their products. It tends to be a technology that's better suited for the most expensive and very complex systems that are either too expensive or too important to fail, is the way that we like to summarize what we do. I'm a nationally and internationally known spacecraft designer. I'm an award-winning designer from both NASA and commercial space industry. And I've been responsible for the design of many spacecraft, commercial, military, as well as NASA. Their manufacture, the testing, and and the launch, and then the on-orbit operations of the spacecraft, as well as the launch vehicles themselves. And so I developed PHM technology on the Air Force's GPS program in order to defeat those Air Force officers who wanted the GPS program to fail and not get funded, fearing that it was going to be so large that it would take over all of the space assets used to support the CIA's mission of national defense. We're located, our office is on Cooper Street in downtown Santa Cruz, 101 Cooper Street, number 237. And so it's a local company. And these are some images of the different programs, space programs that I've worked on. On the left over here is an artist concept for the GPS program. All these different satellites, currently there's about 60 GPS satellites orbiting the Earth at an altitude of about 12,000 miles each. And so this is the GPS space segment that I was responsible for, in addition to the ground segment, which is responsible for making sure that these spacecraft work as they're supposed to. And this is an artist concept for the International Space Station that I helped design and work on for NASA. And that's a picture of the space shuttle, NASA space shuttle. We redesigned our spacecraft in order to fit into the space shuttle back when the space shuttle many years ago was going to support military launches, commercial space launches, as well as NASA launches. And then over in the corner is a picture of the NASA's geostationary weather satellite that I was responsible for the design and test of, 10, called GOES, Geostationary Operational Environmental Satellites for NASA. And these run about $300 million a satellite. The GPS satellite each runs about $80 million. The International Space Station costs the US taxpayers about $100 billion. $100 billion, not million, billion. I was the solid rocket motor test manager for the Titan solid rocket launch vehicle. And these strap-on, I was responsible for the design and the test of the strap-on solid rocket motors that provided enough energy to get the payload up to space. The center core is the original Atlas ICBM that was used to hold a nuclear weapon, or a series of them, back in the 1950s. And they were, the military, because they failed so often, the military had to buy 2 or 3 times the number of ICBM, the Atlas ICBMs, that they had targets for. And that was to ensure that in the event they ever had to actually use the Atlas ICBM to defend the United States, they would have so many available that a few of them would get through and hit their targets. And when I say so many available, I'm talking about 500. They purchased over many years about 500 Atlas ICBMs. And after the Atlas was ruled unsafe to use and to move on to the next ICBM by Congress, Congress ordered the US military to use the Atlas ICBM as a launch vehicle to launch the military satellites. And this particular, I'm sorry, I'm using the word Atlas. This is actually the Titan launch vehicle, the Titan ICBM. And it eventually grew to be the least reliable of all of the different ICBMs that were being used as launch vehicles. And eventually, the military figured out a strategy of how to stop using it, because they were ordered to use all of the 400 or 500 of them that they purchased on launching military satellites. Well, with a failure rate of about 30 to 40% per year of Titan launches, a lot of military spacecraft did not make it to orbit and ended up in the ocean or coming back to Earth. And so that's about a failure rate of anywhere between 3 and 4 out of 10. Every 10 launches of the Titan failed. And so that eventually got decommissioned, I think back in the late 1990s. This is the picture of a commercial satellite called Superbird that I was responsible for, that is designed to use the PHM technology. This was the very first satellite called the Intelsat 7. These are both commercial satellites. This runs about $80 million a satellite, maybe 85. This costs I think closer to $95 million for just a satellite. And this was the first commercial satellite that I designed with PHM technology. Now, the launch vehicles that it takes to put these up into space cost anywhere between $60 and $100 million. So the satellites, these commercial satellites, run between $80 and $100 million, plus another $60 to $80 to $100 million for the rocket that puts them up into space. So they're quite expensive. This is, again, a picture of a commercial satellite that's used for like DirecTV, for television services via satellite. This is an artist's image of the Global Star, a constellation of satellites used for a space-based telephone network. There's two of them. One's called Iridium and one's called Global Star, and those are the satellite, those use the satellite phones that are considerably larger than our cell phones, and they have to have a large antenna because they're communicating with a satellite that's up in space roughly around 300 miles. And so with the atmospheric loss, it requires them to have a little bit larger antenna than our cell phone. And that's what you see on a sat phone is a retractable antenna that you're able to flip up and be able to talk to anybody anywhere around the world using a satellite telephone. This is a picture of the Hubble telescope where I was able to assist in understanding how some of the equipment on board degraded the behavior, be able to explain the behavior that the manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, was not able to do so. And let's see, this is the picture of the Atlas that I was speaking about earlier. This is the Atlas EF that launched the first set of GPS satellites. This was the Atlas ICBM modified to be able to launch satellites. Again, and there was about 500 of these purchased initially, and I believe they're still in use. It's possible that they're still in use. There's still some left over to launch some satellites of low priority. This is simply a chart of company logos that I've worked with. NASA, Orbital is an aerospace company, Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, where we were working on a satellite-based earthquake and space-based prediction system, which would be able to identify and track tsunamis from space after the earthquake occurred. And this is the patch of the GPS. Navstar was the name, they decided to name the satellites Navstar. I think stands for National, I can't remember, Satellite Tracking and Ranging is the last one. Anyway, it's a nickname for the GPS satellites. And each one gets a Navstar number. Tektronix I worked with, and this is a Hubble, Avaya. I also embedded the PHM technology in telecommunications industry computer servers that are used to control the public telephone switching network. And those were, and I sold those to companies like Avaya, Verizon. Let's see, and I worked for Force Computers, which was bought by Motorola, and also sold them to Tektronix as well. They were trying to get into the high reliability computer server market where they were used by the telecommunications industry. They have the servers used in the telecommunications industry has a unique set of requirements. They have to, anytime that there's a natural disaster, our hardline telephone system works. And it works because all of the hardware that are used to support our hardline telephone system, not our cell phones, but the old hardline telephones were designed so that they could work through the 100-year flood, be set on fire for 10 minutes and still work. Let's see, what was the other reliability? Oh, and be able to operate after an 8.0 earthquake. And so that's why before the cell phone industry took over the telephone usage, the hardline telephones always work through natural disasters, and that's the reason why. And the hope today is that there are so many towers that in the event of a catastrophic earthquake, one of the towers would work. And what we found to be untrue. So that if you rely solely on a cell phone for your telephone needs, without the old-fashioned hardline telephone. In the event that California, your area suffers a catastrophic earthquake, you will probably not have cell phone service for quite some time. The cell phone industry does not have to meet the same requirements that the hardline telephone companies did. And as a consequence, companies like Verizon, AT&T are trying to get out of the hardline telephone industry and get over completely into the cell phone wireless industry, simply because of the different requirements with the hardline. Very complex. This is a graph to try to illustrate how unreliable spacecraft is. Started in 1970, the chart starts in 1970, even though the space program, as far as the United States is concerned, started in 1957. But this chart, I had the data from starting with 1970, and this chart shows the yellow boxes indicate the number of satellites launched per year. In the case of 1970, there was a total of three satellites that was launched. And then the red boxes are the number of satellites that, space missions that failed. So in 1970, 3 were launched and 1 failed. As time went on from 1975 all the way out here to 2005, you can see that the number of satellites launched per year, according to this scale over here, continued to increase. And it got at its highest, it would be 18 satellites were launched by the United States in the year about 1992. And of those 18, about 9 of them, that's a 50% failure rate. 9 out of the 18 that were launched in 1992 failed completely. And so those failures include NASA satellites, military satellites, and commercial satellites. Now, the satellites that NASA buys are paid for by the taxpayer. The satellites that the military buys are paid for by the taxpayer, and they are not insured. So that whenever NASA or the military loses either a satellite or a rocket, the American taxpayer is the one who suffers. In the commercial space industry, they purchase insurance because they're a business, and the satellite is an asset that's going to bring income into their company. And so if that satellite is launched and it doesn't make it up to space, and it can't provide the communication services or the imaging services for which the company sells and makes a profit, it has insurance that covers their loss, including the money that they didn't make from that satellite. So in the commercial, speaking generally, in the commercial space industry, they have insurance whose costs are added into the cost of whatever services that they are making money on. And so it pays for the insurance. And so quite often to start a commercial satellite company, you need roughly about $1 billion to purchase the satellites, the launch vehicles, the insurance, the ground infrastructure. So when you hear about a private satellite company getting started and whatever services that they're selling, communication services or imaging, roughly they've got to have investors or money somewhere between $500 and $1 billion to work with. So this chart hopefully is able to show, along with as the number of satellites that we launched every year increased over time, so did the number of satellites that failed catastrophically. And that, again, most of those were paid for by the American taxpayer, most of those failures, because, again, the commercial space industry insures their satellites and their losses. And although this chart runs out at 2006, it just simply extends on to today. Now, people believe that because you don't hear about them in the news, they're not happening. Well, the media doesn't really publicize all of the failures. They occur so often that you can't rely on the media in which to find out when either a rocket or a satellite has failed going to orbit. You have to go to the industry resources, and of course that's what I did. And I was able to get this data from a marketing firm. I've left off the reference of where I got this data from. Frost & Sullivan, a marketing firm called Frost & Sullivan out in Palo Alto. did the research to find out this information that I have here. And so I took it and used it. And again, these lines just keep going out, so that the more of the satellites that get launched up here, the more fail. And PHM technology actually stops these failures from occurring, and that's why it's so valuable. Here's some images of the satellites and the different launch vehicles that have failed over the last few years. This is one of the newer GPS satellites that failed at launch. This is a military classified satellite built by Lockheed Martin in Sunnyvale that failed, and I was involved with that. And a satellite that was going to measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, launched by Orbital, failed. Another orbital launch for Glory, which was a space science satellite. Here's another Intelsat satellite, Intelsat 19 model 19, that failed. Here's a Proton, a Russian launch vehicle that's used to launch American astronauts to the space station. Here's an Indian launch vehicle that failed from India. Here's another, let's see, I believe this is another Indian launch vehicle. This is a $125 million commercial communication satellite by a European organization called Eutelsat, and it failed catastrophically. In fact, 2 in a row failed, and that each one cost $125 million just for the satellite. And remember, another 80 to 100 million for the rocket that put it up there that failed. And then here's the second one. Both of these failed prematurely. So this is a chart that a company called the Aerospace Corporation, a study that they completed. The Aerospace Corporation is the technical arm of the Air Force. Air Force officers often have to relocate about every 4 years. And the way that they provide continuity on their space programs is by employing a private, fully federally funded, with our tax money, company called the Aerospace Corporation that provides continuity on the different military space assets while the officers are transferred about. They did this study, and the bottom line is, I don't expect you to care about any of these numbers, but the results of their study said that after the equipment that went on military satellites was received by the company that was going to integrate them into and build a satellite, that after passing qualification testing, severe amount of environmental testing, that after they were integrated onto the satellite and retested, that they had 4 failures per satellite after this equipment already passed. And they didn't really see any problem with that. They were just noting that their spacecraft are unreliable, and without actually trying to figure out why. And so that's what this chart's about. Here's a follow-up study that they did, that the same company, the Aerospace Corporation, they did another study and said, how effective is our testing that we do on the equipment that I just talked about, and then onto the spacecraft side, the vehicle, integrate all the equipment onto the vehicle. Does the extreme cost of all that testing, does that justify itself in more reliable spacecraft? And what they found out, what they published, was that after they looked at all of the data from the satellites that they could get data from in the military, that for every military satellite that gets launched, there's a 70% likelihood of that satellite failing within the first 45 days after arriving in space. And so this is an indication of how unreliable our military space assets are. And this is the problem that the technology that I license called PHM, this is what it fixes. And so the kind of improvement that if the military contractors who build satellites and launch vehicles for the military was to use PHM technology, this number, 70%, would probably drop down to maybe 10%, 5 to 10% likelihood of a spacecraft failing within the first year. And that's a heck of a lot better than a 70% failing within 45 days. And the reason that spacecraft fail, or really any equipment fails prematurely after it's manufactured at the factory, has to do with the Cold War back in the 1950s. We were shocked to find out that President Stalin of the Soviet Union had built their first ICBM called the R-7 and had also developed a nuclear bomb and put the nuclear bomb on top of the R-7 and was ready to launch it at the United States, because after World War II was over and all of the generals that worked for President Stalin in the Soviet Union anticipated that they were going to be killed. After the war, there was no longer a need, since Hitler had been destroyed and Germany had been destroyed. So why does President Stalin need to have a group of generals who could easily overthrow him as he overthrew his predecessor many decades before? And so the Soviet Union's military did not have a pension plan. What would happen within the Soviet Union's military is officers were killed. They would just disappear, and they would be kidnapped and killed by people who worked for President Stalin. And so these generals that eventually became known as the Politburo, that helped President Stalin defeat Hitler, had to come up with a new enemy, or they were going to lose their lives. And so right after World War II, right after the United States bombed Japan with 2 nuclear bombs, they began telling President Stalin that the United States was planning to attack the Soviet Union with its nuclear weapons. And so President Stalin funded the development of its first nuclear bomb, as well as the development of their first ICBM, both with people that they kidnapped from Germany at the end of World War II. And so in 1953, we saw the first ICBM with a nuclear bomb taken with photographs taken by the CIA sitting out on the launch pad ready to go. And that's when the United States created the Strategic Air Command, started flying B-52 bombers around the Soviet Union 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with live nuclear bombs to let the Russians know that if they were going to launch an ICBM at the United States with a nuclear bomb, that our B-52s would drop their nuclear bombs all over Russia. And that became known as mutual assured destruction, and that policy was in effect until the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the Soviet Union fell apart, and all of its satellite countries became independent, leaving Russia by itself. And now there's Russia, whose President Putin is the president of, and then all of the satellite countries that were part of the Soviet Union are now quasi-independent from Russia, and have their own future in their own hands. Well, 3 years later, after we saw the first ICBM, and we started flying B-52 bombers around Russia, called Strategic Air Command, we had our first Atlas ICBM. And in that process, in order to get our ICBMs ready, the Air Force, which was down at Los Angeles Air Force Station in LA, they had the responsibility of making the ICBM program happen. They used something called concurrent engineering, where they built the ICBM silos that they were going to be launched from, and they built the ICBM, and they built the nuclear payloads all simultaneously. And so we, as a result of that 3-year program, 3 or 4 year program that got us our first ICBM with a nuclear payload on it, they were extremely unreliable. They suffered a failure rate of almost 60%. And every time, that meant 6 out of 10 of those vehicles that were launched would fail. And every time one of the Atlas ICBMs would fail in test, the Air Force would purchase another 100 from the builder, which I think might have been General Dynamics built the Atlas. And so General Dynamics loved it. and because they got to sell another 100 ICBMs every time they had a problem. And so instead of the US government or the US military telling General Dynamics, hey, go back and figure out why your equipment is so unreliable, instead what they told them was, oh, we'll buy another 100. Well, every time that one fails in tests for whatever reason, we'll buy another 100. They never told the contractor to go back and figure out why his equipment, why the ICBMs were failing so often. And so from Atlas, we went to Titan, and then we went to Thor, and we'll be showing, I believe, a chart of the reliability of all of those things. And this chart is meant to explain why equipment fails prematurely after it passes testing. And what this little graph here is supposed to show is the aging characteristics of each one of the little parts, electronic parts, the transistors or the resistors or the capacitors or the diodes or the triodes, how they age over time. What we try to do in ICBMs and rockets is try to build something that these parts must last 7 to 10 years. Well, what this graph shows that some of them will last 7 to 10 years, but others of them will fail prematurely. And the companies that build the equipment are told by the part suppliers that some of our parts will fail prematurely. They promise. And the companies never factored that into their design and test. And so as a result, for the last 50 years of working in space and launching ICBMs, we have very unreliable systems, and that's because the government never told the contractor to go back and figure out why their extremely expensive equipment was failing prematurely, irregardless of what they did to it in test and manufacturing.